In this video, we'll go over all the criminals executed in the United States during the month of November. A total of 4 people were scheduled to die. One of them was even granted clemency while already strapped to the gurney. The executions were carried out using 2 different methods: lethal injection and firing squad. I'll tell you about the crimes they committed, their last words, and the final meals they chose. Bryan Frederick Jennings, State, Florida. The story goes back to May 11, 1979, in the quiet neighborhood of Merritt Island, Brevard County. There, a 20-year-old Marine named Bryan Frederick Jennings was unknowingly on the verge of committing an act of violence that would devastate a family and leave him waiting more than 4 decades for his execution. The night before, on May 10th, Jennings had been out drinking with friends at a local bar. At some point during the night, after several drinks, he stopped in front of the Kunash family home. He walked up to a window and saw the children's bedroom lit by a small nightlight. On the bed lay 6-year-old Rebecca Kunash, sleeping peacefully. After watching her for a few moments, Jennings walked away and continued drinking at 2 different bars. Hours later, heavily intoxicated, Jennings returned to his usual bar. A friend, James Slocum, had to drive him home around midnight because Jennings' pants had ripped. Slocum later said he took the wheel because Jennings was far too drunk to drive. After changing clothes, Slocum drove him back to the bar, but Jennings didn't stay there. Between 4 and 5 a.m. on May 11th, he went back to the Kunash home. Robert and Patricia Kunash were asleep elsewhere in the house, unaware of what was about to happen. In her bedroom, lit only by the soft glow of her nightlight, Rebecca slept, unaware that a predator had returned to her window. Jennings quietly approached the window of Rebecca's room. He carefully removed the protective screen and opened the window. He climbed inside, where the little girl lay sleeping. The Marine covered Rebecca's mouth with his hand to keep her from screaming. He lifted her from the bed and, in the darkness, carried her toward the window. With Rebecca in his arms, Jennings rushed to his car parked nearby. He put her inside and drove to a remote area near the Girard Street Canal on Merritt Island, an isolated spot where no one would hear or see what he was about to do. Once at that secluded spot by the canal, the worst happened. Out of respect for YouTube's policies, I won't use the precise term, but Jennings did the most terrible thing you can do to a child. The attack was so extreme that it caused Rebecca serious injuries and bruising in her area. Jennings used such force that he even ended up with bruises on his own area during the assault. Rebecca, just 6 years old, suffered unimaginable pain as this was happening. But the horror didn't end there. After the assault, in what the court described as an act of inconceivable violence, Jennings grabbed Rebecca by the legs, lifted her upside down over his head, and slammed her onto the ground with all his strength. The impact was so severe that it caused an immediate skull fracture, resulting in deep and fatal brain damage. But Rebecca was still alive. Despite the catastrophic damage to her skull and brain, her small heart was still beating. Jennings then carried her toward the canal. He took the dying child and submerged her head underwater, holding her there for roughly 10 minutes, drowning her until she finally stopped breathing. Rebecca Kunash died from asphyxiation due to drowning. After killing Rebecca, Jennings left her body floating in the canal and fled the scene. Minutes later, he returned to the house where he was staying, arriving around 5 in the morning. His aunt, Catherine Music, who was hosting him during his military leave, saw him stumble inside, leaning against the wall and saying, "Oh, I'm so drunk." His clothes and hair were completely soaked, something she noticed right away. Meanwhile, that same morning, Robert and Patricia Kunash woke up to find that their daughter Rebecca was not in her room. The window was open and the protective screen had been removed. Panic set in as they realized what that meant. They immediately called the police, launching an urgent and desperate search to find their daughter. Later that same day, May 11th, 1979, Rebecca Kunash's body was found floating in a nearby canal. The autopsy confirmed the horrifying reality of what had happened during her disappearance. The investigation moved quickly. Several neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar man lurking near the Kunash home around the time Rebecca went missing, and the description matched that of Bryan Jennings. At the scene, officers also found shoe prints beneath the child's bedroom window. After analyzing them, they discovered they matched exactly the type and size of the shoes Jennings was wearing that day. Hours after Rebecca's body was found, Jennings was detained in Orange County due to an outstanding traffic warrant. During the arrest, officers noticed that his appearance fully matched the description given by witnesses. His clothes and hair were still wet, a detail that tied him directly to the area where Rebecca had been found. Investigators processed the crime scene in Rebecca's bedroom and found fingerprints on the windowsill. 2 experts examined them and confirmed they belonged to Bryan Jennings. At first, Jennings denied any involvement. However, under interrogation, he eventually broke down. He confessed to kidnapping and killing Rebecca Kunash. His confession was recorded on audio and later became a central piece of the case. In February 1980, Jennings was brought to trial before a Brevard County jury. He was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, and other related offenses. The prosecution formally sought the death penalty. During the trial, the jury heard the audio recording of Jennings's confession. Cellmates also testified that he had given them details about the crime. Fingerprint experts took the stand as well, confirming that his prints were found on Rebecca's window. On February 7, 1980, the jury found Jennings guilty on all counts. On May 7, 1980, Circuit Judge Tom Waddell officially sentenced him to death, in addition to imposing 4 life sentences for the other charges. In the years that followed, Jennings filed numerous appeals. On October 27, 1989, he was just 1 day away from being executed in the electric chair after Governor Bob Martinez signed the death warrant. However, on October 26, 1989, the Florida Supreme Court granted a stay, temporarily halting the process. Even so, Jennings remained on death row at Florida State Prison for more than 45 years, becoming one of the longest-serving death row prisoners in the state's history. But eventually, after decades of appeals and delays, his time ran out. On October 10, 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed a new death warrant for Jennings, scheduling his execution for November 13, 2025. Bryan Frederick Jennings was executed on November 13, 2025 at 6 p.m. at Florida State Prison near Stark by lethal injection. He was 66 years old at the time of his death. When asked if he had any final words, Jennings, who kept his eyes closed throughout the process, simply replied, "No." Rebecca's parents were not present. Both had passed away many years earlier, never seeing the execution of the man convicted of killing their daughter. Stephen Corey Bryant, State, South Carolina. In October 2004, when he was just 23 years old, Stephen Corey Bryant unleashed an 8-day violent rampage across rural areas of Sumter County, South Carolina. That string of crimes terrified the entire community, and 2 decades later led him straight to death row. Bryant enjoyed fishing and often spent time at a nearby river. That same night, October 8th, without any apparent reason, he shot a man who was fishing there, hitting him in the back. The victim, 56-year-old Clinton Brown, survived despite his severe injuries and managed to drive himself to a hospital. That attack would be just the prelude to a cold and calculated campaign of terror that would soon paralyze the region. The next day, October 9, 2004, Bryant went out with his friend and co-worker, 36-year-old Clifton Gainey. They were close. They fished together and spent time around each other's families. That day, under the pretext of going out to buy beer, Bryant used a stolen gun to shoot Gainey in the head, killing him instantly and leaving his body on a rural road. 2 days later, on October 11th, Bryant broke into the home of 62-year-old Willard Teitchen, a man he didn't know who lived in a remote part of the county. He used the same method he had already relied on, knocking on the door, pretending he was having car trouble, and earning the victim's trust. Once inside, he shot Tummaine 9 times. But his brutality didn't end there. After killing him, Bryant burned the eyes of the body with lit cigarettes, an act of sadism meant to degrade his victim even after death. While he was ransacking Tummaine's home, taking jewelry, power tools, and other valuables, the phone started ringing. It was Tummaine's daughter, Kimberly Dees, calling from another state. No one answered the first call. On the second try, an unfamiliar voice finally picked up. When someone finally answered the phone, Kimberly heard a man ask, "Who is this?" She told him she was the daughter of Willard Tummaine. What came next froze her in place. "You can't talk to him," the voice said. "I'm the prowler." Then came the most chilling confession of all. "I killed him 3 hours ago," followed by a cold, mocking laugh that ended abruptly with the click of the line, "going dead." The brutality didn't stop there. In an act of absolute contempt for life and the law, Bryant used Tummaine's blood as if it were paint. He wrote taunting messages on the walls of the house. "Victim 4 in 2 weeks, catch me if you can," along with multiple repetitions of "catch me if you can." Before leaving, he placed candles around the body, turning the scene into a kind of macabre altar. Exactly 2 days later, on October 13, 2004, Bryant killed again. This time, his victim was 35-year-old Christopher Earl Burgess, whom he encountered at a convenience store in rural Sumter County. They knew each other casually. After chatting for a bit, they walked out of the store together, and Bryant offered him a ride. On a lonely stretch of road, Bryant pulled out a gun and shot Burgess twice, once in the head and once in the chest. He left Burgess's body in a ditch. Less than 2 hours later, a hunter passing through the area found the remains and notified authorities. Later that same day, Bryant was arrested at his girlfriend's house by local police. Investigators quickly gathered solid evidence linking him to all the crimes. Officers found stolen firearms, items taken from the victims' homes, and clothing matching descriptions given by witnesses. On October 14, 2004, Stephen Corey Bryant was formally charged with 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of aggravated burglary, 2 counts of unlawful possession of a firearm, 1 count of armed robbery, and 1 count of arson. Later investigations even suggested that additional charges could be filed related to the burglaries he committed during his rampage. Even after being taken into custody, his behavior remained violent. In October 2005, while awaiting trial at the Sumter Lee Regional Detention Center, Bryant brutally attacked a correctional officer. He punched the officer repeatedly, even after he was already on the ground and defenseless. The sentencing phase began on September 2, 2008, before a South Carolina judge. The defense argued that Bryant should not receive the death penalty because of his personal history. As in many capital cases, his attorneys focused on portraying a background of deep trauma and long-term abuse that, according to them, South Carolina's institutions failed to address in time. On September 11, 2008, after hearing all the testimony and evidence presented by both sides, the jury found Stephen Corey Bryant guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to death. He received the death penalty for the murder of Willard Tummaine, committed during a burglary, and life sentences for the killings of Clifton Gainey and Christopher Burgess, along with nearly 100 additional years for his other crimes. Over the next 16 years and 9 months, Bryant exhausted every legal remedy available within the U.S. judicial system. His attorneys, some court-appointed and others working pro bono, most of them opponents of capital punishment, filed multiple appeals based on various legal arguments attempting to overturn or delay his sentence. On October 14, 2025, the United States Supreme Court rejected his final appeal, clearing the way for his execution. A few days later, South Carolina Attorney General Kristen Clark filed a motion to set an execution date. The order was delivered to Bryant on October 17, 2025. Under state law, the date must be scheduled for the fourth Friday after the order is received, which set November 14, 2025 as the execution date. On October 31, 2025, exactly 14 days before his execution, Bryant was formally notified of his right to choose. He deliberately selected death by firing squad. With that decision, he became the third inmate in South Carolina to opt for this method since the state resumed executions in September 2024. Stephen Corey Bryant spent his final days on death row without receiving any visits from family members. He spent that time almost entirely alone, with only occasional contact from prison staff and his spiritual advisor. Finally, the day of his execution arrived. On the morning of November 14, 2025, Bryant woke up at 4 a.m. He showered and received a visit from a spiritual counselor. As is standard procedure for executions by firing squad, he was also given sedatives to reduce his anxiety before the process. At 5:45 p.m., Bryant was taken from his cell to the execution chamber. At 5:50 p.m., he was secured to the execution chair with leather straps. The coroner placed the target on his chest directly over the heart, and a hood was placed over his head. The warden read the execution order aloud as witnesses took their places behind the bulletproof glass. At 6:10 p.m., the three shooters fired simultaneously without warning. 3.308 caliber rounds struck Bryant's torso in rapid succession. His body showed involuntary movements and reflexive sounds, but neurological death likely occurred within seconds. The coroner pronounced him dead at 6:20 p.m. Stephen Corey Bryant did not utter any final words. Richard Barry Randolph. State, Florida. On August 15, 1988, at just 26 years old, Richard Barry Randolph committed a brutal act of violence at the Handyway convenience store in East Palatka. 9 months earlier, Randolph had walked into the store looking for a job. He had tried several other places without success until the manager, Minnie Ruth McCollum, saw something in him that others hadn't. Even though he had no work experience, she decided to give him a chance. During the first few months, Richard proved to be dedicated and responsible, and his performance was so strong that Ruth felt confident she had made the right choice. Richard had no family and no stable place to live. Still, thanks to his job, he managed to rent a small house. But everything changed abruptly. Over time, Richard became addicted to cocaine. At first, he used only a little, but the dependency grew to the point where he could no longer pay his rent. He ended up living in a dumpster located beside the store. That situation began to show in his behavior. He was irritable, unkempt, showed up late, and on at least one occasion stole from the business. Because of this, Ruth, reluctantly, made the decision to fire him. On August 15, 1988, the worst happened. Randolph, worn down by months of addiction and living in extreme conditions, walked into the Handyway store that morning intending to rob it. He carried a toy gun, believing it would be enough to intimidate. But when Minnie Ruth McCollum caught him trying to open the safe, an argument broke out that escalated quickly. She realized the weapon wasn't real, and from that moment, everything spiraled out of control. In a prolonged attack, Randolph beat her repeatedly with his hands and slammed her head against hard surfaces. McCollum tried to defend herself, but he strangled her with the drawstring of his sweatshirt until she lost consciousness. When she came to and began screaming for help, he resumed the assault, striking her again until she was unable to resist. Then, in an even more brutal escalation, he grabbed a small knife and stabbed her several times in the neck and head. After that, he removed her clothing from the waist down and sexually assaulted her. After the attack, Randolph took McCollum's car keys, stole her vehicle, and at the same time, witnesses Terry Sorrell, Dorothy Patilla, and Deborah Patilla saw him wearing an employee shirt, locking the front door of the Handyway convenience store. The women questioned Randolph about why the store was closed and where McCollum was. Randolph told them that McCollum's car had broken down and that she had borrowed his. He said he had already fixed her car and was on his way to pick her up. Then he walked away from the store. The three women looked through the store window. They saw that the security camera was out of its usual position and that there were cables in the trash can. They also noticed that the store was in disarray. The trash can was overturned and the counter was a mess. Concerned, they called the sheriff's office to report the situation. But by that time, Randolph had already fled. An officer arrived quickly and found McCollum still alive. She was lying on her back, struggling to breathe and letting out faint moans, with blood running from her head and neck. She was rushed to the hospital in a coma. She remained unconscious for 6 days before ultimately dying from the severe brain injuries caused by the beating and attack carried out by Randolph. Randolph was arrested later that same day at a grocery store in Jacksonville, where he was trying to borrow money and cash several lottery tickets he had stolen from McCollum's store. After taking him into custody, investigators had him point out the blood-stained clothing he had discarded while fleeing. Shortly afterward, Randolph confessed to the attack and provided a detailed account of what had happened. In 1989, he was found guilty of first-degree murder, armed robbery, sexual assault, and grand theft. During the penalty phase, the jury voted 8-4 in favor of the death penalty. The judge accepted the recommendation and imposed a capital sentence. The court identified 4 aggravating factors. The crime was committed during a sexual assault. It was carried out to avoid arrest. It was motivated by financial gain, and it was deemed especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. Randolph spent more than 3 decades on Florida's death row. For 35 years, he filed appeals, post-conviction motions, habeas petitions, and clemency requests, all of which were denied. Over the years, Randolph developed systemic lupus, an autoimmune disease that severely compromised his health. Medical experts warned that, because of his condition, Florida's 3-drug lethal injection protocol could cause extreme pain and death by suffocation, potentially violating the 8th Amendment. However, in November 2025, the Florida Supreme Court rejected these claims, ruling that they had been filed past the allowed deadline. On October 21, 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant, scheduling Randolph's execution for November 20, 2025, at 6 p.m. Eastern Time at Florida State Prison near Stark. With this, he became the 17th person executed in Florida in 2025, the highest annual total recorded in the state since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. The day of Richard Berry Randolph's execution finally arrived. Richard woke up at 4 a.m., took a shower, and received a visit from a spiritual advisor. He had no family visits or phone calls. He had grown up an orphan. His final meal had been offered the night before, a double hamburger with lettuce and tomato, fried onion rings with ketchup, and a serving of cherry pie with whipped cream. At 5:50 p.m., he was taken to the execution chamber. At 6 p.m., officials began attempting to establish an IV line, and after several minutes, the drugs finally began to flow. The entire process lasted about 6 minutes. Richard moved, gasped, and grimaced before he died. His death was officially pronounced at 6:30 p.m. Throughout the procedure, he remained silent, eyes closed. When given the opportunity to offer final words, he chose not to speak. The execution proceeded without incident, aside from the initial delay in locating a suitable vein. The lights in the viewing room were kept off, except for the minimal illumination needed inside the chamber. There were no demonstrations or protests outside the prison. Tremane Wood, State, Oklahoma. Tremane Wood, 46, was sentenced to death in 2004 for the murder of 19-year-old farm worker Ronnie Whipf, who was stabbed to death during a robbery attempt at an Oklahoma City motel on New Year's Eve in 2002. However, the case was marked by a clear injustice. Tremane's older brother, Jake Wood, publicly confessed to being the one who actually stabbed the victim. Jake received only a life sentence, while Tremane was sent to death row. Jake Wood later died by prison in 2019. On November 13, 2025, just minutes before his scheduled execution at 10 a.m. at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Republican Governor Kevin Stitt commuted his sentence to life without parole, following a 3-2 recommendation from the state's Pardon and Parole Board. What made the case extraordinary was that the victim's family, along with the surviving victim of the attack, Arnold Kleinsasser, publicly opposed Wood's execution, which played a major role in the governor's decision. Stitt emphasized that the commutation ensures Wood receives the same punishment as the true killer and guarantees he will spend the rest of his life in prison. This was only the second time in nearly 7 years in office that Stitt granted clemency to a death row inmate, the first being Julius Jones in 2021. For December of this year, 3 more people are scheduled to be executed, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss updates on those cases. That's all for today. Let me know in the comments what you think.